Walt Whitman Jr., arguably America's most influential and innovative poet, was born into a working-class family in West Hills, New York, a village near Hempstead, Long Island, on May 31, 1819. He was the second son of Walter and Louisa Whitman, a generational family of farmers. In spring 1823, the family moved to Brooklyn, New York, and during this early period of Whitman's life, his family moved to a new house almost every year due to his father's profession. Walt attended a Brooklyn public school and was hardly an outstanding student. He hated corporal punishment, a common practice in schools and one that he would attack in later years in both his journalism and fiction. Most of Whitman's meaningful education came outside of school. He visited museums, went to libraries, and attended lectures. His formal education ended at the age of 11, when he began working as an errand boy at a Brooklyn law firm. Throughout his life, Whitman preferred idleness to nose-to-the-grindstone labor, and it was this penchant for idleness that allowed him to be the keen observer and poet that he was. His employers encouraged him to read by giving him a library subscription, and this became a signal event of his life. Whitman forged his own rough and informal curriculum of literature, theater, history, geography, music, and archaeology, in contrast to the structured education of his contemporary poets. In 1831, Whitman became an apprentice on the Long Island Patriot, where he learned the printing trade. Whitman later continued this work at the Star, where he discovered his passion for writing. However, it was only during his stint as a schoolteacher in the 1840s that he began to write short stories. Influenced by a feud with his father, many of his stories centered around a son being treated badly by his father. By the mid-1840s, Whitman had a keen awareness of the cultural resources of New York City and probably had more inside knowledge of New York journalism than anyone else in Brooklyn. The Long Island Star recognized his value as a journalist, and once he resettled in Brooklyn, quickly arranged to have him compose a series of editorials from September 1845 to March 1846. Whitman soon took the place of the editor of the Brooklyn Eagle. By dedicating himself to journalism in these years, he published little of his own poetry and fiction. However, he introduced literary reviewing to the Eagle, and he commented, if often superficially, on writers such as Carlyle and Emerson, who in the next decade would have a significant impact on his work. In 1846, Whitman met J.E. McClure, who intended to launch a New Orleans paper, The Crescent, and was given an advance to cover his travel expenses to New Orleans. The journey by train, steamboat, and stagecoach widened Walt's sense of the country's scope and diversity, and was the first time Whitman left New York City after his childhood. The populous city of New Orleans imprinted his brain with its shows, architecture, customs, traditions, etc., which surfaced in poems in his book, Leaves of Grass. A pivotal and empowering change came over Whitman at this time of poetic transformation. His politics, and especially his racial attitudes, underwent a profound alteration. Prior to his journey to New Orleans, Whitman advanced the interest of white working men, while seeming at times unconcerned about the plight of blacks. However, the New Orleans experience had prompted a change in attitude, a change that was intensified by an increasing number of friendships with radical thinkers and writers who led Whitman to rethink his attitudes towards the issue of race. As a result, in Whitman's future-oriented poetry, blacks became central to his new literary project and central to his understanding of democracy. Whitman published the first edition of his poetry composition, Leaves of Grass, in 1856, and within a few months of producing his first edition of Leaves, Whitman was already hard at work on the second edition. Whitman received virtually no recognition for his poetry during his lifetime in America, including any awards. Some of his most important influences include the Italian opera, and he is quoted as saying, "Were it not for the opera, I could never have written Leaves of Grass." Shakespeare, especially Richard III, and Whitman was especially attracted to Junius Brutus Booth, the father of John Wilkes Booth's performance, the Bible, and Thomas Carlyle's Sartor Resartus.
O Captain, my Captain, our fearful trip is done. The ship has weathered every rack. The prize we sought is won. The port is near, the bells I hear, the people all exulting, while follow eyes the steady keel. the vessel, grim and daring. But oh heart, 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 oh the bleeding drops of red, where on the deck my captain lies, fallen cold and dead. O captain, my captain, rise up and hear the bells. Rise up, for you the flag is flung, for you the bugle trills, for you the bouquets and ribboned wreaths, for you the shores are crowding, for you they call the swaying mass, their eager faces turning. O captain, dear father, this arm beneath your head, it is some dream that on the deck you have fallen cold and dead. My captain does not answer. His lips are pale and still. My father does not feel my arm. He has no pulse nor will. The ship is anchored safe and sound, its voyage closed and done. From fearful trip the victor ship comes in with object won. Exult, O shores, and ring, O bells. But I, with mournful tread, walk the deck my captain lies, fallen cold and dead.
This poem is considered an elegy for Abraham Lincoln's death after the Civil War. In the first stanza, Captain refers to President Lincoln. Whitman is saying that Lincoln has steered the United States through the Civil War, leading to Union victory. While everyone is celebrating this grand victory, the speaker realizes the captain is missing and finds him dead. In the second stanza, the speaker tries to convince the captain to get up and join the celebration, as he is the one to lead the ship or the country to victory. As in the stages of grief, the speaker is refusing to believe the death of his captain when he says, "It is some dream that on the deck you've fallen cold and dead." In the third stanza, the speaker is accepting the fact that his captain is dead. While everyone else is celebrating the victory, the speaker is mourning the death of his beloved captain. Some of the literary devices used throughout the poem include synecdoche. While follow eyes the steady keel, Whitman uses the keel to represent the entire ship, a metaphor for the nation. The swaying mast, their eager faces turning. Whitman uses the eager faces to represent the elated crowd, a metaphor for the population. His lips are pale and still. Whitman uses the stillness of the lips to represent the captain's state of death. Exult, O shores. Whitman uses the shores to represent the entire nation, rejoicing after the Civil War. Imagery is also extensively used throughout the poem. For instance, bleeding drops of red, cold and dead, bugle trills, swaying masts, their eager faces turning, lips are pale and still, mournful tread, cold and dead. The tone of the poem is celebratory yet somber. For instance, Whitman writes, "Bleeding drops of red, fallen cold and dead, rise up and hear the bells. Exult, O shores, and ring, O bells." This effectively communicates the despair and the hoping against hope that the narrator is feeling throughout the poem. In this poem, Whitman uses simple and uncomplicated yet specific word choices to allow the reader to know how the speaker feels. For instance, fearful trip, vessel grim and daring. There are also many instances of apostrophe throughout the play. For instance, the narrator talking to the captain. "Exult, O shores, and ring, O bells. But oh, heart, heart, heart." The symbolism and allusion allow Whitman to hint at a deeper meaning to the poem than its literal one. For instance, the captain alludes to Abraham Lincoln. The ship symbolizes the United States of America. The fearful trip signifies the Civil War, and the port signifies Union victory. Mainly, the meter of the poem is in an iambic meter, and it can be found in the second half of lines 1, 9, and 17, as well as throughout lines 2, 10, and 18. According to the literary critic James A. Wright, Whitman's "O Captain, My Captain" is one of the few instances when Whitman uses iambic measure in his poems, which offers a helpful contrast to the inventive delicacy of music in Whitman's other works. In her article, Poetry and the Mediation of Value, Whitman on Lincoln, Helen Vendler states, "In adopting the voice of the young boy mourning his father, Whitman has sacrificed his own voice entirely. Because he valued and validated the claim of his audience, he represents their heavy hearts by becoming one of them. Wanting to value democracy, he thought he had to exemplify it by submitting to the rhythms and rhymes and cliches of the popular verse, prized by the soldiers, rather than inventing a democratic form of his own. Because he was bent on registering individual response as well as a collective wish, he took on the voice of a single representative sailor, silencing his own idiosyncratic voice. And wanting to show the sailor and his father, captain, as participants in a national endeavor, he adopted the allegorical cliché of the ship of state as the ruling metaphor of his poem."
When I heard the learned astronomer, when the proofs, the figures, were ranged in columns before me, when I was shown the charts and the diagrams to add, divide, and measure them, when I, sitting, heard the astronomer, where he lectured with much applause in the lecture room, how soon, unaccountable, I became tired and sick, till rising and gliding out, I wandered off by myself in the mystical, moist night air, and from time to time looked up in perfect silence at the stars.
Walt Whitman carefully and cleverly articulates his point of view, the typical views and ideologies of the Romanticism movement, but he disguises it in the allegory of the poem. In these first few lines, there is clearly a sense of distance presented between the astronomer and the narrator. This is the basis that leads directly to an opposition between the ideologies that the astronomer represents and that of the author later on in the poem. In the second line, Whitman explains the astronomer's proofs and figures, which the astronomer uses to justify his learnt understanding of the astronomy and the way the universe works and functions. Everything the astronomer presents is categorized and broken down into scientific reasoning, charted and examined in a scientific setting. Through Whitman's own vernacular, it is obvious to see that it is difficult for him, a romantic, to understand. He continues to carry this imagery in the next lines with words such as charts and diagrams. The narrator is bombarded with so many scientific facts that he is clearly overwhelmed and cannot fully comprehend the logical explanations of the astronomer. This poem concerns different ways of knowing, being convinced rationally about something by hearing from the experts, as opposed to experiencing it directly, intimately, and intuitively for yourself. Writing the poem in free verse allows him to tailor the form to the content instead of superimposing on it a pre-existing stanza pattern and rhyme scheme. For example, in the first half of the poem, he keeps increasing the length of the lines. As a result, this part of the poem begins to drag and grow repetitious and boring, just as a lecture on astronomy does for the speaker of the poem. The form and the sound of the poem then shift when the speaker leaves the lecture hall. The lines now grow progressively shorter, and we get a pleasant musical alliteration, as seen in time to time and mystical, moist. In addition, the repetition causes the first part of the poem to drag and grow boring, just as a lecture on astronomy does for the speaker of the poem. The repetition of R sounds to convey the impression that the lecture drones on and on. However, when the speaker leaves the lecture hall, instead of droning R sounds, we get a crisp, clean, long I vowel and M and S consonants, as can be seen in words such as rising, gliding, I, by myself, night, silence, stars, etc. Whitman also utilizes anaphora in the poem, as can be seen in the following lines. when I heard the learned astronomer, when the proofs, the figures were ranged in columns before me, when I was shown the charts, the diagrams to add, divide, and measure them, when I, sitting, heard the astronomer where he lectured with much applause in the lecture room. Whitman conjures up for us a vision of the dark night sky studded with lights that are arranged not in neat rows but irregularly, or in constellations created by the poetic human imagination. Whitman might be playing with sight as well as sound when he contrasts his two different experiences. In the lecture hall, all of the seats would be arranged in orderly rows facing the podium. Also, he indicates that the lecturer is using charts and diagrams which feature figures ranged in columns before him. This rigid, repetitious order disappears when the speaker of the poem flees the hall. Once outside the orderly classroom, he says that he wandered off by himself. The verb he uses suggests a spontaneous, free, irregular movement that contrasts with the straight lines that oppressed him earlier. And the final image of the poem is the stars, which are also organized irregularly in constellations. The message Whitman is trying to communicate throughout the poem is that scientific rationalizing and logical reasoning is above his intellectual capabilities in understanding the magic of how the stars work. And this is conveyed by the tone of the poem, which is reminiscent and narrative to give the impression that Whitman is telling a story, which adds to the deeper meaning of the poem. He explains sometimes things are best left unexplained so that they maintain their mystical brilliance. The underlying message of the poem is that mere numbers, charts, and diagrams cannot sum up the mystery, power, and beauty of the universe. To begin to understand the wonder of the universe, one must view it through the lens of the unaided eye rather than the lens of the calibrated telescope in order to see a glimmer of its meaning. According to the literary critic Russell James Picus, Whitman is too clever of a writer to directly state the meaning behind his poetry, but it is definitely understood through the mastery of his words. He makes good use of the character of the astronomer in this poem simply to demonstrate the dichotomy to the concept that he actually wishes to express. According to New York Times writer and literary critic Abby McGanny Nolan, this poem isn't about the Civil War but about another sort of division, the gulf between knowledge and imagination. The first half of the 8-line poem tells of listening to an astronomy lecture full of proofs, figures, charts, and diagrams. The second half has a narrator gliding out of the lecture room. A quotation from Einstein rephrases the point. Imagination is more important than knowledge. Knowledge is limited. Imagination encircles the world.
A child said, "What is the grass?" fetching it to me with full hands. How could I answer the child? I do not know what it is any more than he. I guess it must be the flag of my disposition, out of hopeful green stuff woven. Or I guess it is the handkerchief of the Lord, a scented gift and remembrancer designedly dropped, bearing the owner's name some way in the corners, that we may see and remark and say, whose? Or I guess the grass is itself a child, the produced babe of the vegetation. Or I guess it is a uniform hieroglyphic, and it means sprouting alike in broad zones and narrow zones, growing among black folks as among white, Canuck, Tuckahoe, Congressman, Cuff. I give them the same, I receive them the same. And now it seems to me the beautiful uncut hair of graves. Tenderly will I use you, curling grass. It may be you transpire from the breasts of young men. It may be if I had known them, I would have loved them. It may be you are from old people, or from offspring taken soon out of their mother's laps. And here you are, the mother's laps. This grass is very dark to be from the white heads of old mothers, darker than the colorless beards of old men, dark to come from under the faint red roofs of mouths. Oh, I perceive after all so many uttering tongues, and I perceive they do not come from the roofs of mouths for nothing. I wish I could translate the hints about the dead young men and women, and the hints about old men and mothers, and the offspring taken soon out of their laps. What do you think has become of the young and old men? And what do you think has become of the women and children? They are alive and well somewhere. The smallest sprout shows there is really no death. And if ever there was, it led forward life, and does not wait at the end to arrest it, and ceased the moment life appeared. All goes onward and outward. Nothing collapses, and to die is different from what anyone supposed, and luckier.
Throughout the play, Whitman uses grass and explains its relation to people, nature, and the universe. About grass, he writes, "Or I guess it is the handkerchief of the Lord. Or I guess the grass is itself a child, the produced babe of the vegetation. Or I guess it is a uniform hieroglyphic. And now it seems to me the beautiful uncut hair of graves." Whitman uses allusion to convey the idea of diversity using examples of different groups. He writes, "Canuck, Tuckahoe, Congressman, Cuff, I give them the same, I receive the same." Whitman uses imagery to create a vivid mental picture of the poem in the mind of the reader. He writes, "Dark to come from under the faint red roofs of mouths. Or I guess it is the handkerchief of the Lord, a scented gift and Rembrandtser designedly dropped, bearing the owner's name some way in the corners. Beautiful uncut hair of graves, darker than the colorless beards of old men." By using parallel structure, Whitman creates a satisfying rhythm used to emphasize key points in a poem. It may be you transpire from the breasts of young men. It may be if I had known them, I would have loved them. It may be you are from old people, or from offspring taken soon out of their mother's laps. Tone. The tone of the poem is hopeful and optimistic. Walt Whitman displays his positive view of death, so there is no sense of sorrow or idea of mourning. Instead, Whitman is just curious of the lives of the deceased and wishes he could have known them. The theme of the poem is that life is beautifully lived when you realize how beautiful death is. The poem emphasizes a positive view of death and the idea that even in the event of a death, life goes on, and the person will still be alive and well in some part of the universe. There's also a theme of equality and diversity in age, gender, and race, meaning that everybody is treated the same by nature, a fundamental idea of democracy. According to the literary commentator Roy Harvey Pierce, Song of Myself is the first recognizable American epic, but it is an epic of a peculiar and modern sort. It does not celebrate a hero in an action of ancient days. It creates a hero of future days, trusting thereby to summon the heroism implicit in each individual. In his book, Walt Whitman Reconsidered, Richard Chase believes that Song of Myself is a playful, paradoxical look at many sides of the poem's protagonist. Chase states that most of the poem, Song of Myself, has to do not with the self searching for a final identity, but with the self escaping a series of identities. It is this combination of attitudes that allow the poet to weave the most astonishing embellishments of a wit and lyric song.